And we're live. It is Friday. It is May 9th, the year of our Lord 2025. And what do we know about May 9th? Well, of course, May 9th is Russian Victory Day. And if the weather permits, I will be out projecting this evening at the Russian embassy uh, um, to honor, if that's the right word, that day. But there are other things that happen on May 9th. For example, in 1901, Australia opened its first national parliament in Melbourne. In 1945, the Channel Islands were liberated from Nazi occupation, and I bet you didn't know that. In 2002, a 38-day standoff at the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem came to an end when Palestinians inside agreed to have 13 suspected terrorists deported to different countries. And of course, May 9th is the birthday in 1888 of Francisco Baracca, the Italian fighter pilot who was killed in 1918. It is the birthday of Baldur von Schirach, the German politician who died in 1974. And it is the birthday of Candice Bergen. So all in all, May 9th is a big day. It is 8:02 a.m. The sun is not shining. It is quite dreary in Washington, in fact, which raises a question about the viability of the special military operation I have planned for this evening. We're going to hope for the best. The Russians should not be able to go through a May 9th unmolested by me, but we're going to deal with what comes. The birds are chirping, however. They woke me up this morning, and it's going to be a great freaking day, and you are watching Dogshirt TV, and one of the revolutionary features is, of which there are many, is that sometimes I fail to get a guest and I fail to get a co-host, and I don't even have people who might or might not show up over the course of the hour. I mean, I've put out the word, but I'm not optimistic about it. You know, everybody's got a good excuse. Um, uh, but I'm thinking I'm on my own today. You use your Macaulay Culkin, whatever. Um, Another one of the revolutionary features, and there are many, is that, I'm going to plow on, and if the Greek chorus doesn't rescue me and, come on, I'm just going to talk for an hour, and I'm at peace with that. Though it is a suboptimal show, frankly, but we'll see what happens. Maybe John Roush will pop in. Maybe, somebody else will show up. Everybody seemed to be busy today. So whatever. All right. First off, Albert suggests Pope comments. We want to talk about the Pope. So first of all, I'm bitterly disappointed that I was not named Pope. Once again, this is like the fifth or sixth conclave of my life. I have been passed over. And, I understand that not everybody is entitled, none of us is entitled to be Pope. But I think, look, I had hopes. I'm not going to pretend to not be disappointed. I think the church missed a real opportunity here to have the first Jewish pope, um, and to have the first pope who has a real sense of humor about the whole church thing. Look, I understand that it would have been an irregular choice, but I still, every time my hopes get up a little bit, and I I do feel that we have, you just have many opportunities. You only have so many opportunities. And look, it's like every year when they announce the MacArthur Genius Awards. I never expect to get a MacArthur Genius Award. But another year goes by without my getting it, and it grates on you over time. Also, they had the election for Speaker of the House, and everybody always points out that you don't have to be um, they don't have to be a member of the House to become Speaker. And everybody, they select some clown from Louisiana, and it hurts. And so I just want to say about the new pope, I wish him the best. Really, really, I earnestly wish him the best. Hello, Nastya.
Hi.
What a surprise.
I decided to save your ass for this
Um,
morning.
I hear you, but that's because I don't have my headphones on. I see. I know this time why it is. I don't think it's because you are. You're. Um, I know why it is. There we go. Were you disappointed that I was not selected Pope yesterday?
I was a little bit disappointed. That's actually exactly what I wanted to talk about because I was just listening to the daily about the whole situation. So
All right. Well, let's talk about it.
I know, like, I understand so little about why this thing even matters. I mean, okay, so let me give you my immediate thoughts when I heard that, the
That I wasn't selected, and
no.
that they. I mean, look. I'm just. It hurts,
I mean, there's little problem with you being Jewish, but that's beside
Yeah,
the
there's a
point.
little bit with problem with my being Jewish. There's a little problem with my being not a cardinal.
A
There's a
lot of
little
problems.
there's problems, but yet, you you shouldn't get your hopes up. And yet,
Um, I just don't like. I just don't know why this is that big of a deal. But that's because I'm not. I mean, it's because I'm not like very religious. But I mean, even within like as interested I am in religion. Wait, isn't what? Wait, what's the sentence I'm trying to say? As interested in religion as I am. That's the right way to say it. And the context of my religious background, it's like I'm really interested in Islam, and then I have a Christian, like, Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox kind of background. So Catholicism is just like I know the least about Catholicism is what I'm trying to say. So, like, it's just very interesting to me.
well, it's so what's the question?
I
Why
mean,
does
the
anybody
question.
care?
Well, I mean, I get why why the Catholics care, right? It's a religious
Yeah,
thing.
and there are 1.4 billion of them.
It's
And so,
yeah.
like, why do people, it's like even in the United States where the church is in decline, um, it is
Guys are still
still,
very religious. Like
yeah, Americans are comparatively quite religious compared
like
to Europeans.
more than Ukrainians. Like we're
Oh
not
yeah, yeah, yeah.
we're
Well,
not
you
really
guys had many years of Soviet suppression of religion.
right.
And um, but um,
So I've read that like MAGA are unhappy about this guy because he supports migrants or whatnot. What, like, isn't this supposed to be like a huge victory? And, Trump is supposed to be selling this as like this amazing thing because he's the first American. Was he
I don't
elected for like political reasons? Okay, I'm gonna really dumb down my question, and it may sound very stupid, but here it is. Like, did they elect him to like push back against the Trump madness? Do you know what I mean?
so yeah, no, I
He's
understand the
American
question.
and he will have legitimacy to like talk about American role in the world or something. I don't know.
So, so first of all, you know, anytime you elect somebody, you're talking about the distributed. Let's assume for a moment that Catholic doctrine about the conclave, which is that God intervenes to have the people choose the right person. Let's just assume that's wrong for a moment.
Right.
And that this is an election like any other election with a only with a very small voter base,
Hmm.
of the College of Cardinals. And we also don't know, we never really get to find out why people voted because they do tend to honor the code of silence about the conclave. And so, um, now I don't think people experience their votes as political in the sense that like we are doing this to send a message to
Yeah.
Donald Trump that blah blah blah.
Okay.
But if you ask the same question in moral terms, and you say you're trying is the church trying to take a stand on certain moral issues that present in the political space as
Yeah.
well. For example, how should you treat migrants?
Yeah.
How should you, absolutely. And
Okay.
what's the difference between moral leadership and political leadership? Well, the church is an interesting presentation of that question because
Mm.
number one, it um, doesn't exercise, except in a very formal sense in a particular neighborhood in Rome, it doesn't exercise political power anymore, but it used to, right? The Papal States are not that, were not that long ago. Central Italy used to be the kingdom of the Pope. And so but the second feature of that is that the church's politics are a weird mix of liberalism and conservatism. So in the United States, we tend to think of them as a conservative bastion because of their social policy teachings, particularly with respect to birth control and abortion. But if you are in Latin America, the church is complicated because number one, it has been um, it has really represented over many years the interests of a lot of peasants, and the poor tend to organize around the church, and that dates back to like relatively shortly after the conquest, the Jesuits and the Franciscans became kind of the representatives of indigenous interests, at a time when the Spanish attitude was incredibly rapacious. And so, if you go to, I, Michael Sean Winters on this show the day that Francis died said, the rich don't need the church, but the poor do. And that's like a genuine ethos of the Catholic Church, notwithstanding the palaces and the gigantic art collection in Rome, which is amazing, and the history of popes being,
I was gonna say evil.
thieves
It
and
sounds bad.
Oh, I don't look. I
But you know
mean,
what I'm talking about.
yeah, that like this is an institution of genuine human corruption over time across a lot of different vectors,
Mhm.
from sexual abuse to uh, wealth amassing to political power. It is also an institution that has represented a lot of people in their struggles with people more powerful than they are, and so I think the when you say politics, which politics, the guy was registered to vote in, uh, and apparently voted in several Republican primaries in Illinois. That's not because he's trying to, he's a lib, right? But in the biggest issues that the church confronts today, which, contrary to when I was, you know, 25, 30 years ago, when you talked about the church's politics, you were talking about abortion. You were talking about birth control. Now, when you talk about the church's politics, you might just as well be talking about, you know, migration. You might just as well be talking about, um, uh, a set of issues on a social support for poor people. You might just as well be talking about matters on which the church code's quite left. And so I don't think it is a I don't think it's a designed as a political message to Trump, and not just Trump, but also to, Giorgia Maloney, who's closer to home, right, and hates immigrants just as much. But I do think it's a moral message to those people, which may not be any different.
Okay. So the dumbed down version of your answer to my dumbed down question is yes.
I
Okay.
mean, look, this is
Because that was my
a
first thought. I was like,
so
that's obviously somehow connected to the Trump presidency.
so think of the church as the ultimate reality show, right? Like it's like 2000 years of reality show, down to they have the smoke, right? So,
Yeah, I've
they're
seen all
really
the
good.
movies. It's
They're
fascinating.
really good at it. The white smoke, the black smoke, they got these incredible
It's
churches. They're fabulous at this stuff. And there's drama, always drama.
it's so
Um
bad, I think.
it's
Like,
it's I mean, look, as coming from a religious tradition that eschews this and doesn't do this stuff, except that we recreate it in other ways, I love it. I think the idea that your religious tradition should be a TV show for you. And if you think about it, and should be entertaining, and you should be um and you should watch it and follow along. Um I think it's awesome. I love it. Um
I never understood and still don't understand this, like, the institution element of religion or the human element of religion. Like it seems wrong to me. Like the only times I've ever felt like truly faithful and like religious, including when my dad died, I had that little pivot for the sake of comfort, as many people do. They go through something terrible in their life. Like I remember I went, like, literally after my dad died, I like asked my mom to drive me to a nearby church like almost every day, and I just sat there. Like I literally just sat there on a bench and like looked at icons and stuff. But I never, like, but even in that point it always seemed weird for me to like seek some sort of advice or whatever from, like, whatever they're called, the people who work at the church, because like they're humans just like I am. Like I never, like at any moment when I felt some sort of connection to God, it was always, there were no intermediaries there. Like I didn't
well,
need, it seemed weird.
that that's very, Protestant Reformation of you. Direct relationship with God. You
Okay.
don't need
I don't
Um,
need some woman in a dress or whatever, you know.
yeah, well, the Pope doesn't think you need a woman in a dress
I'm
either.
not, by the
Hello,
way,
Richard
for
Wattenbarger.
very faithful people in the audience, I'm not trying to be disrespectful.
No, well, Richard has an interesting religious background.
I'm,
Born Jewish, grew up Episcopal, joined a cult at one point, if I recall, and settled on musicology. So I'm. We now have three non-Catholics here to talk about Leo the 14th. And by the way, E.J. Wittes compiled some excellent uh, data points about Leo's 13 predecessors named Leo as Pope, some of which are doozies in today's Dog Shirt Daily. Richard, what's on your mind this morning?
Well, I just want to make a correction. First of all, I'm an Episcopalian, which means I'm a JV Catholic. So okay. So, um, I couldn't make the team, but anyway, uh, um,
Isn't
uh,
that what I said?
JV Catholic is a technical term that
Oh,
you did not
that I
use.
didn't use. I see.
Yeah,
Okay. Whoops.
yeah. So I just I wanted to be precise about that.
Yeah.
Um, but the second thing about you know, so about having been born Jewish, my I found my birth parents when I was about 46, 45, and we ended up having a great relationship. My adopted parents, not so much, but now I find myself between two worlds, sort of, and the hardest thing, or the most annoying thing for me, is um, that I don't get the Jewish jokes. I mean, the in jokes, and I feel really left out. So,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Jewish humor is it's interesting because I think, a lot of Jewish humor is closely related to dark Eastern European humor. But it is its own thing, and there are these jokes that you just can't explain to non-Jews.
Yeah, yeah,
They're just, you know, you know, if you're and there are these jokes that you can tell in a mixed crowd, and you can just figure out who's Jewish by who laughs.
my favorite religious joke connected to Ben and I is that in our family we joke that Ben is our daughter's godfather, except I'm Orthodox Christian. My husband was raised Muslim, was raised in Islam, and you are Jewish, Ben. So
But I am actually the godfather of uh, um, somebody in the Episcopal Church, and so it is a joke, but it's actually literally true.
I mean,
Um,
a lot of people, like our friends, like I remember when I was pregnant or when I was just born, they'd ask us like, "What are you doing about that like religious component?" Because my husband, he grew up Muslim, but he isn't practicing anymore. I like sort of grew up, but only insofar, you know how it is in Ukraine, Ben. It's like everyone is religious, but not really. Like it's all just a cultural kind of thing. Like Ukrainians have done this, we're gonna do it, but no one has ever actually explained to me what any of it means.
Although I have been surprised in my uh, exploration of the Ukrainian community in Washington how religious a lot of people like the
But in what way?
Ukrainian
Like, give me
Ukra-
examples.
like go to church every Sunday.
That's
Like
rare.
the Ukrainian Orthodox churches here are busy, active, and people, and
But I
I'm
think that's
used to.
it's because it's a part of the Ukrainian community. Like people want to go somewhere where there will be other Ukrainians, kind of thing. Like I think that's what it is more than anything. Like I remember when the full-scale invasion just began and I was in Paris, I would go to a mass at a Ukrainian church and like I'm, I was just there as like we're all praying for the people who are defending our country. It's like a community vibe, not necessarily a religious thing.
Interesting.
Yeah, like
Well,
because a lot of it is just like with Easter, for example, our rituals that we do at Easter, like everyone does it, but like we don't do it necessarily.
painting eggs, you mean?
Painting eggs, going to the church, like dressing up, bringing the little baskets with the thing. So the guy from the church does his thingy with the water. Like we all do it, but like if you ask someone, what does this actually mean? Like, have you read the religious text? Like, do you know what's happening?
It
Like,
sounds like Judaism. Like we don't even speak the language that the liturgy is written in. At least except for Israelis. Um,
asked him,
what
what is the religious significance of the eggs? I don't know. John asked.
Actually, I think nobody knows.
I don't know why it's.
I think the historical significance, religious significance of Easter eggs is really lost in the mist of time. Um, so yeah, I mean, yeah, I've spent a lot of time over the years thinking that one of the biggest psychological differences between Israelis and non-Israeli Jews is being able to read the liturgy and, just understanding it. That I think that creates a, a genuinely different religious experience, whether you're religious or not, that you're actually, I mean, biblical and liturgical Hebrew is not really the same as modern Hebrew, but you can work through it. Um, and, the church in Vatican II shifted away from the Latin Mass to the vernacular Mass. Um, Judaism has never done that. And so um, the result is that except through the creation of Israel, which is to say, the going back to the revival of Hebrew culture, the revival of the idea that you would pray in the vernacular is a creature of the revival of the Hebrew language, not of any religious, and in fact was fiercely resisted by the ultra Orthodox for that reason. And so I think there's something really interesting and different about the experience of growing up with prayer in the vernacular than in some other language, which brings me to a question about Ukrainian Orthodox churches, which is, what language is the service in? Is it in Ukrainian? Is it in Church Slavonic? What is it?
That's a good question. I think it's in Ukrainian. I mean, I know that in the Russian linked churches, which still exist, unfortunately, and some people still go there. I think there it's in Russian, and then the ones that have separated, it's in Ukrainian. Um, yeah, but like all Ukrainian, I'm sure it has like the Church Slavonic, because our Ukrainian has its roots in the Church Slavonic. So
Right.
I like it kind of sounds like Ukrainian, but then there's like half of it you can't really make out what it is. So it's some sort of mix of Church
So
Slavonic and Ukrainian.
in response to John Hawkinson's question, Church Slavonic is related to both Russian and Ukrainian, sort of the way Middle English or Old English, not Old English, because as Nastia says, you can get a lot of it, particularly if you know certain words that are associated with the liturgy. Um, I would say it's very archaic sounding, but not wholly uh alien. It's not like listening to, Anglo-Saxon or pre-Norman English. Um, Sorry, you were saying, Richard.
Oh well, so you keep going off on these tangents that um, make me want to ask some questions that are kind of along the tangent. But are you familiar with the Slavonic Mass by Janacek?
I I am not.
Oh,
Um,
it's a wonderful, wonderful piece. I recommend it highly.
Interesting. I will check it out.
Yeah.
I actually don't know a lot of Janacek.
Oh, well, yeah, Janacek's a wonderful composer, and the Slavonic Mass is a good place to start, actually. So,
Well, I am going to see next week the Missa Solemnis, so I'm in a mood to listen to good mass pieces.
in
And
Washington,
yep,
that National Symphony.
yes.
Oh, wow. Well, I'm going away for vacation next week. Otherwise, I would almost, I would consider going down for that. So, um,
Alas, it's on
alas.
Thursday. It's next Thursday. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, quite an experience. The couple of years ago, the Philadelphia Orchestra was doing it, and it's such an overwhelming piece. And I got in line to get the rush tickets for it, and before the line started moving, I just realized the piece is so big, so much to take in that I realized I couldn't go. It was going to be too much.
whoa.
It's just it is like, well, see, in my in my head, like the four greatest pieces of music are the Saint Matthew Passion, the uh, uh, Don Giovanni, Tristan und Isolde, and the Missa Solemnis, and um,
Well, it's
that
definitely high up on my list too.
yeah,
I have
it,
not seen it live in a long time, and I'm very excited about it.
yeah, it's really something. But what I wanted to back to earlier in your conversation about the politics behind the choosing of the Pope. My mind keeps going back to 1978 and the election of Karol Wojtyla. And at the time, and I think for good reason, a lot of people saw that as uh, the Vatican sending a message to Moscow,
Yes.
um, uh, about especially when you had the Polish Catholic Church, which was you know, very potent and very maybe the most prominent symbol of resistance to um,
And
Soviet rule.
it coincided with the rise of the Solidarity movement,
Right.
or at least the beginnings of it, and of course, uh, Pope John Paul became very associated with Lech Walesa and
Hmm. Right.
supportive of Solidarity, and so it was. But I think it's importantly different because the Polish Church under communism was a remarkable engine of resistance and was a church. I mean, when Pope John Paul would go to Poland under communism, he would get like 2 million Poles in the street. It was, I mean, I was a kid
Hmm.
then, as were you, but um, I remember it. It was
Hmm.
really like, you know, the I grew up Jewish on the Upper West Side. The Pope was not a popular figure in the community. And by the way, neither was Poland.
Hmm.
um, and but it was impossible not to be moved by that.
Hmm.
Um, and the interesting thing about the choice of Prevost is that this is they've gone to a church in decline, not a church on the
Hmm.
ascendancy. Um, and John Paul was the first non-Italian pope, let alone Polish, but they went to a place where the church's significance was on the rise, right? In the Soviet dominated world, in uh, here they've gone to a place where the church is in decline, where and it does feel different to me for that reason, that you know is it an attempt to shore something up? Is it an attempt, is it just done without reference to that? And, you know, you get kind of a twofer because he spent 23 years in Peru. And so maybe, you know, there's a Latin America aspect to it. But I find it very surprising, other than Nastia's original point, which is the point this is making to Trump and J.D. Vance. I don't really understand what the message of it is.
Now, I, I, one of the things. Well, first of all, I was, I guess, as surprised as anyone that we'd end up with an American. I didn't think I'd see that in my lifetime. But my my sense is that the uh, in some ways, Provost does not. He is he's not typically American in the sense that the things that he stands for go so much are so strongly aligned with the church and not with American culture, at least at this point in the history, and and given the current geopolitical situation, um, it, I think that lends him some moral authority that um, lends him an extra ounce of moral authority uh, on the world stage, and certainly in the U.S. You've got this guy from the U.S. who is going to be he's well, we would say be taking on a prophetic role, speaking truth to power, saying, speaking out for against injustice as someone who, on one hand, represents the source of that injustice, by nationality, but at the same time is saying, "Hey, I'm not, um, I'm, I'm Catholic first, I'm not American first, and this is uh, and I expect Catholics to be, Catholic first, and
So let me ask you about that. I
you
want to go back to Nastia's question of why this matters.
know,
So, you know, when you replace the Aga Khan, who got replaced recently because, he died, there isn't like front page, wall to wall. Now, granted, that's a smaller religious movement, but it's not small. I mean, there's a lot of Ismaili Muslims in the world. And when you replace the Archbishop of Canterbury, uh, you don't, it's not international news. The Anglican Communion, yeah, kind of like trudges on, but uh, and when you replace, I mean, there is no head of Judaism, but like people just don't get the Southern Baptist Convention. Why do people care so much about is it the reality show element, which granted is spectacular? Is it the fact that it's really big and centralized? I.e., 1.4 billion is a lot of people. Is it the aspect that it used to be sovereign, which I think it has this weird quality of, you're having a new head of state installed because Vatican City is notionally sovereign. What is the explanation in your judgment for the ferocity of attention that it gets relative to the ascendance of any other religious figure around the world?
well, uh, certainly the Pope is an influential figure among large swaths of the population in, certainly in North America, in South America, still in parts of Europe, and so the and the Pope and the Vatican still does set the it sets. the moral terms of discussion for a sizable number of people uh, in the world who are going to have effects on, who are going to have effects on public policy, downstream from the things that they do within the church. And uh, so I think there's that element. I think there's also an inertial element, the fact that, and certainly in our awareness, the rise of um, broadcast media, it's taken place focused. So much of what we're accustomed to is taken place in that context where in these Western contexts where uh, where Catholicism is prominent and has played a role. I'm uh, trying to work out some messy connections in here.
Nastya,
Um,
do you
yeah,
think
yeah.
in Ukraine, does it get the same kind of coverage that it gets in, I mean, do people care outside of kind of Western Ukraine where there is a significant number of Catholics?
I don't know if like you went on a street in Kyiv and like and did like a vox pop and asked random people what they think. I don't think any of them even clocked like what was happening. But like the news outlets that I follow and like the various activists and members of the civil society who are like public figures, they were all talking about it. Well, talking about it insofar as to like, oh, the smoke is white, he's elected. Like there was coverage of it.
But coverage of it as a reality show,
Yeah, like as this is happening, and like in
Real
regards to the
Housewives of
previous,
the Vatican.
yeah, but in regards to the previous pope, to Pope Francis, uh, he was not very loved in Ukraine.
Yeah, so talk us through that. Beloved everywhere else in the world except in MAGA and in Ukraine,
That's a
but not
very
for the same,
interesting,
but not for the same reasons.
very much
Um,
no.
why do Ukrainians dislike Pope Francis?
Well, because we're in the position where like we can't really appreciate anyone who talks about seeking peace to save the Russians and Ukrainians because the killing has to stop. Like, like putting the Ukrainians and the Russians on the same kind of plate and just say that this whole thing is like the politicians are the ones bickering and the regular civilians are dying for the sake of politics. Like, that's not really a narrative that we like accept or appreciate because it's like our response is like, you couldn't have said that about the Germans and the Jews in the World War II.
Although the Pope did.
Oh my God.
I'm
Well,
no, I'm sort of
okay,
I'm
okay.
sort of
I thought
I'm
you were
sort
like
of
referring to
joking.
specific things that would be bad.
Pope Pius was it was it's not a great moment for the Papa for in the history of the papacy, the Pope's handling of the Holocaust.
Well, so that's kind of how Ukrainians see it. Like there was this
Yeah.
one moment when Francis said something about like the imperial legacy of Russia being that like the war has to stop because this is great Russia. These are the sons and daughters of Catherine the Great. He said some shit like that, and all of us Ukrainians were like, "Are you actually out of your mind right now? Like, how could he even utter that? Like, it's shocking, right? Like, full on embracing Russian imperial legacy." Which was like, it's not about the Bolshoi theater or the ballet. It's like about slaughter of entire peoples on the territory of modern day Ukraine and Russia, right? So like him talking about all of these things or like doing all of these like both sides, right? Like the Ukrainian Russian children has to stop dying or like, all of that. Like we were like, you can't like you have to take a stance and the war is pretty black and white. So
Well,
yeah.
that's interesting, Nastya, because so one of the things that you're implying is that the Pope does or can matter. And I mean, obviously, Ukrainians care what the Pope says, even if it's
Because he says the wrong
wrong.
Yeah.
So why, why would you care? I mean, that's partially I ask that partially rhetorically, but also, seriously.
Well, usually this kind of thing would be followed by like, like if some sort of important, influential Ukrainian would write a post about it, they'd be like, no one gives a crap about what you're saying anyway. Like, just go back to your Vatican palace and like sit there and like don't even comment on this issue. Like, they would follow it up by this vibe of like, you're not that important. Like, why are you talking about Peter the Great or something? So for us, it's just like, Ukrainians will bicker about this kind of stuff any day. Like, wake us up at 2 a.m. and ask us to comment on someone who loves, the Russian ballet. We will give you a speech. So it's not necessarily about the Pope being important. It's because, like, there's so much unreleased energy and tension in our society, which is completely understandable. We're going through extremely traumatic things that like we just can't, we just don't let it go. Like we clog these things, even if, like, if a random Republican senator is going to say something like that, you will see the wrath of the Ukrainian society. Even, Ben knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah, so look, there's a lot of pent up, you know, there there's a lot of pent up anger among ordinary Ukrainians, both at home and in the diaspora, in just the way humans emotionally interact with Russia. Um, if you know, you read your Dostoevsky in private, don't tell your Ukrainian friends about it, right? Like that's going to bring out a
Exactly.
Pushkin in particular.
Exactly.
Um, you
Even though I
know,
grew up reading Pushkin.
yeah, I mean, there's just the admiration, the world's admiration for historical Russian culture is a source of genuine irritation for Ukrainians who see imperialism stamped all over that culture. And,
Yeah.
you know, that is, I think, very similar to, you know, the way Jews of a certain generation engage with, Wagner, right? Okay, we understand you think it's great, but it was the fucking soundtrack to the Nuremberg rallies, okay? Bear, and only it's not just Wagner, right? It's as though all of German, you know, Jews never had a problem with Bach. They never had a problem with
Mm.
Mozart. They never had a problem with Brahms. Um, it was pretty limited to, a Wagner issue. But in the case of Russian culture, the amount of it that is meaningfully stamped by the imperial project is immense. And
Like, this is not our emotions. This is a fact. I'm glad that Ben, an American, is talking about it.
no, it's just true. It's much more like, you know, 19th century American culture being indelibly stamped across the board by race and slavery and, uh, you know, Indian conquest. And you can, if you're like me, you can love Rudyard Kipling anyway because the Just So stories are the greatest piece of children's literature ever written. But you can't not engage, right? The fact that he was a theoretician of racism and imperialism, both on America's behalf and on Britain's behalf. You can't pretend he's just a literary figure, and also, um, and the difference is for Americans, we are kind of taught it that way. I mean, when you read, uh, people read Huck Finn with an understanding that this is one of the great works of American literature, and it's got some issues, right? Like people read Russian literature without a sense of
Exactly.
that there's a complicated reality to it.
Hmm.
And as somebody who studied Russian in college in order to read Russian literature, I had no sense of that at all. Um,
Exactly. That's
and
exactly the problem.
I think the Ukrainians can be almost pathological about it. Like, you shouldn't read Dostoevsky, you shouldn't read Putin, but like, I'm not there, but I also listen to Wagner. And but um, you shouldn't read it without some sense that it's complicated. That's my view of it.
Well, the thing is about literature, or music, or whatever, is that you do have that element of technique that is shown brilliantly in, you know, Dostoevsky or Wagner. Just the sheer, you know, what they're able to do with the language, or what they're able to do with harmony and form and all these sorts of things. And that's one of the big things that complicates it all,
Right.
because you've got, um, so in America, we read Dostoevsky for what tells us about the human condition, what he says about the human condition. And um, and often, for many people, what's important about Dostoevsky, if you're an American, often does not touch on its relationship to Russian culture. There's a
Exact
loss and a gain there.
exactly. And that's actually part of the problem, because
Mhm,
you read it for, you know, you can read Crime and Punishment, and it's a total page turner.
mhm,
It's and you change the name Raskolnikov to, I don't know, Jeffrey Dahmer. And like, you could set it anywhere. There's nothing particularly Russian about it if you read it that way.
mhm,
And but what you come away with if you do that a lot, particularly less with Crime and Punishment, because it at the end of the day is a very intimate portrait of a detective and a criminal. But if you do it with Tolstoy in particular, or with um, or with some of the others who are writing about the big themes, including, by the way, Dostoevsky in The Brothers K, right? Like, you're writing about the big themes, and the big themes are Russia, right? Russia's
mhm,
place in the world, Russia's relationship with France and and these are the imperial assumptions are just stamped all over it, in very much the same way that is true of Wagner. That
mhm,
um, he's very self-consciously laying a groundwork for a political and cultural orientation. And I think people imbibe that, the idea that Russia is necessarily big, that Russia is necessarily centralized and looking to the czar, the idea that Russia necessarily controls the uh, adorable peasant peoples around it, who have these quaint ways and peasant dresses. That stuff is just baked into the cake. Um and
You tell him, Ben. You tell him.
oh no, I mean, I look,
yeah.
I don't,
This
but
is making me very happy.
I say that as somebody who consumes it. And yet it influences you. There's shit you have to unlearn when you deal with um uh when when you try to take what you learned from Russian literature and apply it to your knowledge of the modern world. You really do have to unlearn some of that stuff. And and I will say, in defense of the more extreme Ukrainians that I know on this subject, um, they are more selective about it than they sometimes admit in their rhetoric. For example, they go after Tchaikovsky and Swan Lake. Like, if there's a performance of Swan Lake, you'll have. They don't
There will
go
be a
after
protest.
They don't go after Shostakovich or Prokofiev. You know, well, why? Because one of them is great Russian culture and the other was oppressed by Stalin, right? Like, and I don't even think they know that, right? Like, I don't even think there's like a, that like Nastia's friends who will go out and protest Tchaikovsky are like particularly aware. Like, if you ask them the music history, who is Shostakovich, who's Prokofiev, like, I'm not sure they know that stuff, but it doesn't rankle them the same way because nobody holds up Prokofiev as this is great Russian culture, right? And it's 20th century
Exactly.
stuff. It's not, it doesn't have that 19th century valence. And by the way, if you scratch the surface, this is somebody who, Stalin was about to kill 100 times, right? Um, and so I think there is actually like a lot of the rhetoric is really unsophisticated, but there's actually a pretty sophisticated understanding of what in Russian culture is actually objectionable and what is not laced underneath it.
I think it's interesting. So it, but what about Ukrainian attitudes towards Wagner? I mean, Germany was no friend to Ukraine, and
Yeah, we're
I mean,
not
I'm talking about in
right now.
historically,
I
Well,
mean,
right?
Ukraine, look, has its own historical reckoning to do.
Hmm.
Um, and specifically, the, you know, this is a very complicated society. It is completely unreasonable to expect Ukrainians to do that while they're under fire. Um,
Right.
and, someday there will have to be a conversation between Jews and Ukrainians about Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who is,
yeah,
remembered as a George Washington-like figure to Ukrainians, and who is
there's a
remembered.
statue of him near my school where I went to. Like
Yeah, and he
big,
is,
and
probably the third biggest Jew killer of the, after Hitler and Torquemada, of the post, medieval period. And eventually, I think it's perfectly reasonable to expect Ukrainians to think about that a little bit. While Kiev is under attack, come on,
Yeah.
that's not how societies do that sort of thing. And
True.
um, you
it's
know,
not going to be productive right now.
right.
Like,
And the it's also not, it's not a reasonable thing to ask people, when you're under fire, revisit your heroes. Come on, who does that? Um, and I also think it is possible for people to have a revered place in somebody's history for certain things, even as we keep in mind certain other things about them. And I would start with Richard Wagner as an example of that. And I don't think it is too difficult to say, really great composer. By the way, great writer too. He wrote all those libretti himself. He was reinvented everything we thought we understood about tonality. He's genuinely important, and he was a psycho, who laid the groundwork philosophically for a bunch of Nazism. I don't think it is too hard to keep those two ideas in your mind at the same time, whether about Wagner or Pushkin or um, or George Washington,
Yeah.
right? Like we keep in our mind at the same time that he is a slave owner and an Indian killer and the father of our nation. And I don't think like you need to repudiate all of George Washington. Um, and I don't think you need to repudiate all of Dostoevsky. I just think there's like the request that people be complicated about things is not where I thought this show was going. We started with the Pope, we ended with Wagner and
Yeah, we gotta
Dostoevsky.
go
It
because
is time to wrap up. Thank you, Nastia, for joining today unexpectedly. Thank you, Richard, for popping in and hanging around. Folks, we're going to be back on Monday. Guess who's going to be back on Monday? Holly and the Cactus will be back from their week-long vacation. And we're going to... in the meantime, by the way, big announcement. If you are in the Washington area on Sunday, we are going to be doing the 4th annual sunflower planting outside the Russian embassy. And huge news, the owner of the field across the street from the Russian embassy has sold it to a developer. And the developer welcomes planting of sunflowers on the field. So he has joined. We have now, it's like a half-acre lot. We're going to plant a huge field full of sunflowers, and more than even the Russian embassy motherfuckers can destroy. So that's all going to happen Sunday evening, 6:00 p.m. You should join us. And if you do, or if you don't, I will see you on Monday morning. Take care.